Naomi Carter walked into the courtroom with the same quiet confidence she always carried, though today felt different. The faded walls and high ceilings seemed to close in on her as she took a seat in the back, waiting for her name to be called. She had lived in this town all her life, but it wasn't her home anymore. Not the way it used to be. Naomi had changed. She had spent years working behind the scenes on legal reforms that could shift the very foundation of how laws affected people like her, people who lived in the margins. Today, though, she wasn't in Washington, D.C., fighting for sweeping policy changes. Today, she was in this courtroom, facing a seemingly minor case involving a zoning violation for a small community gathering. Judge Thomas Harrison's gavel echoed through the room, signaling the start of another busy morning. Naomi had crossed paths with the judge a few times before, though never in a way that stood out. Harrison was known for his strict rulings, and Naomi had always felt like he operated with an unwavering confidence, one that often dismissed the voices of people who didn't fit his narrow vision of right and wrong. When her name was called, Naomi stood and approached the bench. Her posture was calm, her eyes steady, though beneath the surface, her heart raced. She had been organizing a small neighborhood event, a fundraiser for local students who couldn't afford school supplies. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple gathering in a park. Naomi had assumed the permit requirement was a formality, but when she had been asked to present one, she had realized her mistake. She had reached out to the city, but by the time the event came together, the paperwork hadn't gone through. Judge Harrison didn't seem to care much for the specifics. He leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he addressed her, his voice firm. "You were aware of the regulations, Miss Carter. This event went forward without the proper permits, and that's not how things work here." His tone was dismissive, the kind Naomi had grown all too familiar with. The words stung, but Naomi wasn't here to fight about a technicality. She had more important battles to face elsewhere. "I understand, Your Honor," she replied evenly. "I'm willing to pay the fine, but I hope you'll also consider the value the event brought to our community. There's more to the work I do than paperwork." The judge didn't acknowledge her words. Instead, he gave a curt nod and quickly issued the fine, one that was far more than she had anticipated. Naomi stood there for a moment, the weight of the fine sinking in. It wasn't just the money. It was the principle. For a moment, it felt like a personal blow, but she quickly brushed it off. As she left the courtroom, Naomi's mind wasn't on the fine. It was on the larger fight she had ahead. Judge Harrison might never understand the importance of the work she did, but that wouldn't stop her. She had more important battles to fight, and the real work was just beginning. Naomi walked out of the courthouse, the sharp winter air biting at her skin as she made her way down the street. The fine was heavy, but it wasn't the real battle. For her, the courthouse was just a small moment in a much bigger picture. As she headed back to her car, she thought about the countless hours spent in meetings, drafting policy proposals, and engaging with policymakers who didn't always understand the scope of the problems she was tackling. The weight of the fine was temporary, but the work she was doing in Washington could affect generations. Naomi wasn't the type to flaunt her accomplishments, preferring to stay behind the scenes and let her work speak for itself. Most people in her hometown had no idea what she was truly involved in. They saw a quiet woman, committed to her community, who occasionally organized small events, never realizing that she was shaping the very laws that protected civil rights at a federal level. But that was by design. Naomi knew how quickly the world could become distracted by her identity as a black woman, or by her age or appearance. If she showed too much of herself, the message might be lost in the noise. At her desk later that afternoon, Naomi returned to the project she had been working on. It was a new initiative she had spent months developing, a comprehensive set of reforms aimed at strengthening protections against discrimination in housing, education, and voting rights. The proposal had the potential to reshape federal law, closing loopholes that allowed marginalized communities to continue facing systemic inequality. She had partnered with legal experts, academics, and influential lawmakers who shared her vision. And despite the obstacles, her movement was gaining momentum. But in Washington, power rarely came from your title or your position. It was about the quiet persistence, finding those moments of influence, pushing just enough to shift things little by little. Naomi was brilliant at that. She knew how to make allies out of skeptics and how to stay focused on the long-term goal, even when setbacks threatened to derail her. No one was immune to her quiet charisma. Naomi's brilliance lay in her ability to persuade with logic, passion, and a calm that made people stop and listen, even when they thought they knew better. Her phone buzzed, and Naomi glanced at the screen. It was a message from one of her contacts at the Department of Justice, confirming that her draft on civil rights protections had made it to the desk of a key senator, a crucial step forward. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. This was the kind of breakthrough she had been working for. Still, Naomi couldn't forget the face of Judge Harrison, the way he had dismissed her that morning. The fine was nothing, but it stung in a way she couldn't ignore. It reminded her that the world, for all its progress, was still full of people who couldn't, or wouldn't, see the bigger picture. That only fueled her resolve. The path ahead was long, but Naomi knew this was just one of many battles she would win. It was a reminder. Even the smallest decisions could be part of something much larger. And she was ready for whatever came next. The day after the court hearing, Naomi's name began to circulate. It started small, an article in the local paper, a post on social media from someone who had attended the event. But soon, it spread like wildfire. The headline was simple: "Local woman fined for organizing charity event without permit." To anyone who didn't know her, it was just another local news blurb. But for those who followed her work, who knew what she had been quietly pushing for, it was a different story. Across the country, Naomi was already becoming a symbol. Some saw her fine as an unfortunate accident, a minor bureaucratic snafu that didn't deserve the attention it was getting. But to others, especially those involved in the fight for civil rights, it became a sign of something much larger. Here was a woman who had spent years working to shape federal policy, someone who understood how to navigate the corridors of power, but was being dismissed over a small technicality by a judge who didn't see her for what she truly represented. The contrast didn't sit well with many. Her supporters rallied behind her, voicing their frustration on social media and at town hall meetings. They dug deeper into her work, highlighting her legal proposals that would improve protections for minorities and make legal processes fairer for those historically marginalized. What had started as an innocuous zoning issue quickly became the focal point for a much broader conversation about equality, fairness, and the state of civil rights protections in America. Yet Naomi didn't seek the attention. She hadn't asked for it, and she certainly didn't need it. But now it was here, and it wasn't going away. Every morning, her inbox was flooded with messages, supporters asking for advice, activists seeking guidance, lawmakers requesting meetings. Naomi sifted through them methodically, responding to those who could help her take the next step in her work. The fine, in a strange way, had accelerated her mission. While the national conversation surrounding her grew louder, Naomi kept her eyes on the bigger picture. She wasn't interested in public spectacle. She had a clear goal. The attention only served as a reminder that her message was resonating. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from a well-known legal scholar she had met briefly at a conference. The scholar had written a post supporting Naomi's stance and calling attention to the disparity in how cases like hers were handled. Naomi's heart lifted. This was exactly the kind of support she needed. People in positions of influence who understood the stakes. However, there was also a growing sense of unease within Naomi. While she was grateful for the support, she knew there were risks. Every victory she had gained in Washington had come at a cost. Each new proposal she pushed forward had made powerful enemies. Now, with her name in the spotlight for reasons that had nothing to do with her actual work, Naomi wondered whether it might lead to distractions. Would people focus on her as a symbol instead of the cause she was advocating for? Would the judge's fine, in the long run, be a setback. Despite the uncertainty, Naomi couldn't help but feel a flicker of something else. Momentum. The fine had sparked a conversation she had hoped would happen. Now she had to make sure it didn't fizzle out before it turned into real change. She wasn't about to let a moment of injustice define her. She was going to use it to propel herself forward. The fight was just beginning. Judge Thomas Harrison sat in his office late that afternoon, his gaze fixed on the stack of legal briefs before him. His usual routine was to sift through cases, make decisions, and move on. But today, his thoughts kept circling back to Naomi Carter. The fine he had imposed on her had seemed straightforward enough at the time. She'd broken a local zoning regulation, and in his mind, there was no room for leniency. She had violated the rules. It was his job to enforce them. But now, as he sat alone in his office, those simple justifications began to feel hollow. Over the past few days, he had been hearing Naomi's name more and more. On the news, in casual conversation at local diners, even in some legal circles. What had seemed like a minor incident had quickly become something much bigger. He was hearing terms like human rights reform and civil liberties tossed around with her name attached, and it gnawed at him. There were whispers that Naomi wasn't just any community organizer. She was an influential voice in legal reform at a national level, working to draft policy changes aimed at expanding civil rights protections across the country. She had been involved in high-profile legal discussions and had even been consulted by lawmakers in Washington, D.C. Her initiatives were making waves, reforms that could shift the way people thought about equality in housing, education, and voting. The more Harrison dug into her background, the more he realized he might have misjudged her. The fine. He thought it was just a minor infraction, but now he saw it in a different light. Naomi wasn't just an activist. She was shaping the future of federal human rights law. He couldn't ignore the feeling that he had imposed the fine on someone who, in the grand scheme of things, was doing far more for justice than he ever had. It bothered him. The disconnect between who Naomi really was and the decision he had made. Was it his responsibility to have understood her better before issuing that penalty? Should he have recognized the bigger picture? The self-doubt lingered for days, and Judge Harrison found himself replaying their interaction in his head, wondering what might have happened if he had listened to her, instead of dismissing her with a quick ruling. He had prided himself on being impartial, on sticking strictly to the law, but Naomi's calm, composed response in the courtroom had stayed with him. She hadn't argued with him, hadn't tried to defend herself in a way that made him feel she was trying to manipulate the system. Instead, she had simply pointed out the value of what she was doing, and in that moment, Harrison hadn't been able to see it. The more he reflected, the more he realized how little he knew about the lives of the people he was passing judgment on. Naomi had been fighting battles on a level he couldn't quite comprehend. It wasn't just about following the rules. It was about changing the very system that created those rules in the first place. Now Harrison couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to learn more. He couldn't remain ignorant of the bigger picture, especially when someone like Naomi was showing him just how much was at stake. He had made a decision in the courtroom that morning, but he knew now that there was much more to Naomi Carter than he had ever imagined. And it was a truth he couldn't ignore any longer. As the weeks passed, Naomi continued to move forward with quiet determination, but the attention surrounding her case only grew louder. Every day seemed to bring new messages, new interviews, new calls for her to speak at conferences or rallies. She was becoming a household name, but Naomi remained focused on the work she had been doing for years. The fine, while still a frustrating memory, had become a mere blip in the larger picture she was creating. Her initiative to reform federal human rights protections was gaining traction. The policy draft she had worked on for months was now in the hands of key legislators who were beginning to recognize the importance of the changes she was proposing. Naomi had spent countless hours with legal experts and activists, carefully crafting a comprehensive set of reforms aimed at closing the gaps in laws that allowed inequality to persist. She was pushing for more robust protections in housing, education, and voting, areas where she knew the system was rigged to favor some while disadvantaging others. But there was one thing Naomi understood better than anyone. Change didn't happen overnight. Every step forward came with its own set of challenges, and many of those challenges were the result of forces much larger than any one person could control. Naomi had seen firsthand how lawmakers, lobbyists, and even judges were often more interested in maintaining the status quo than in making meaningful change. Still, Naomi had learned how to navigate that world. She knew the language, the rules of engagement, and the power of persistence. Each time she met with a new ally or spoke in front of a room full of people, she reminded herself of the bigger picture. The road she was walking wasn't easy, but she was in it for the long haul. Meanwhile, in the small town she had grown up in, Naomi's case continued to ripple outward. The media had picked up on the fact that a local judge had fined a woman who was, quite possibly, one of the most influential legal minds in the country at the moment. People began to wonder, how could someone so dedicated to justice be treated this way? How had the judge been so unaware of who she was? It was becoming a national conversation, and though Naomi hadn't sought it, she saw the opportunities it could bring. She could either allow this moment to fade or use it as a stepping stone to push for broader change. The more she saw her name attached to media coverage, the more she realized the moment was right for her to lead the charge. One evening, as Naomi was preparing for a conference call with lawmakers, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from her contact at the Department of Justice, letting her know that her proposed amendments to federal civil rights laws had been discussed in a Senate hearing and had received strong support from key senators. Naomi smiled, a quiet but unmistakable sense of pride washing over her. The movement she had started was no longer just a series of ideas. It was gaining the momentum she had worked so tirelessly for. And the judge. Naomi knew that, sooner or later, he would come around. But for now, she had work to do. The real battle was just beginning. Months had passed since Naomi's fine, but the fallout had yet to die down. The media storm had quieted, but the conversation surrounding her work was only growing stronger. Naomi was no longer just an advocate. She was a force. Her proposed reforms were beginning to shake the national dialogue on civil rights, and the political establishment had started to take notice. But despite her growing prominence, Naomi hadn't forgotten where it all started. The small town, the courtroom, and the judge who had dismissed her with a fine. Then, it happened. Naomi received an invitation to speak at a prestigious legal conference in Washington, D.C. It was the kind of event that brought together thought leaders, policymakers, and legal professionals to discuss the most pressing issues in the field. And to her surprise, the conference organizers informed her that Judge Thomas Harrison would be speaking on the same panel. At first, Naomi considered declining the invitation. The idea of sharing a stage with the judge who had fined her felt uncomfortable, even antagonistic. But then, as she thought about it more, Naomi realized that this was the perfect opportunity, not just for her, but for him as well. If there was a chance for him to understand the scope of the work she was doing and the reasons behind it, this could be it. It would be a conversation, an exchange of ideas, something far more powerful than a courtroom confrontation. The day of the conference arrived, and Naomi entered the bustling venue with a sense of purpose. She was dressed in a tailored suit, a stark contrast to the woman the judge had seen months ago in the courthouse, someone who, to him, had seemed like just another face in the crowd. Now, Naomi was a woman who had the ear of senators, the respect of civil rights groups, and the attention of the media. When she took her seat on the panel, she noticed Judge Harrison in the front row, flipping through his notes. He looked far less confident than she remembered, his brow furrowed as he glanced up at her. The tension was palpable. The moderator introduced Naomi first, and she took a deep breath before stepping up to the microphone. "Thank you for having me today," she began, her voice steady and calm. "The work I've been focused on is simple. We need a legal framework that guarantees the right to equality and justice for every person, no matter their race, background, or socioeconomic status." Her words flowed easily, And Naomi spoke with a passion that was both measured and powerful. She described her work on the new civil rights protections and why reform was not just a matter of policy, but a matter of moral responsibility. As she spoke, Naomi could see the judge's eyes narrowing, his discomfort growing. He shifted in his seat but said nothing. When it was his turn, he stood, hesitated for a moment, and then began discussing his experience with the law. His tone was less sure, and the usual confidence he exuded seemed to be slipping. "I believe the law is meant to serve all," he began, but his words felt rehearsed, almost defensive. The moderator, sensing the tension, asked him a pointed question. "Judge Harrison, how do you reconcile your belief in fairness with your decision to fine Miss Carter for something as minor as an event without a permit?" The question hung in the air, and Naomi felt the weight of it settle in her chest. She didn't need to say anything. His answer, or lack of one, would speak volumes. The judge hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between the audience and Naomi. He cleared his throat, but the words didn't come easily. Naomi's calmness in the face of his discomfort was a stark contrast to the tension in the room. As the judge fumbled for an answer, Naomi realized that he was starting to see the larger truth. This wasn't just about a zoning violation anymore. It was about a system that needed to be examined, questioned, and ultimately changed. The moment passed, but Naomi knew that something significant had happened. The judge wasn't just being forced to confront her. He was being forced to confront the very system he had long been a part of. She had spoken her truth, and now it was his turn to find his. In the weeks following the conference, Naomi noticed something in the air around Judge Harrison. He was no longer the confident, inflexible figure she had once encountered in the courtroom. It was subtle at first, small signs that he was grappling with the conversation they had shared on that panel. Naomi had moved on to the next chapter of her work, focusing on the intricacies of her reform proposals as they gained momentum in legislative discussions. But for the judge, that conference seemed to mark the beginning of something more profound. Harrison began to read more about Naomi's work. He dug into the reports she had co-authored, the interviews she had given, the laws she was challenging. He found himself seeking out literature on civil rights protections and the modern legal landscape. At first, it was intellectual curiosity, an attempt to understand what had made him feel so unsettled after hearing Naomi speak. But it quickly grew into something more. He couldn't ignore the reality that he had been blind to how the law, in its technicalities, could sometimes serve to entrench injustice. His colleagues noticed the change too. Harrison, who had once prided himself on being a staunch, rule-abiding judge, began raising questions about the assumptions that had guided his career. He began attending workshops on judicial bias and fairness, things he had never thought to explore before. When a recent case involving a marginalized group came before him, Harrison found himself taking extra time to consider the broader implications of his ruling. It wasn't just about upholding the letter of the law anymore. It was about the spirit of it. He began to ask himself, was this decision truly just? Was it in line with the values that Naomi had spoken about? The more he reflected, the more his previous decisions started to feel like cracks in a foundation he had once believed was solid. The fine he had imposed on Naomi seemed like a small act in the grand scheme of things, but to him now, it symbolized something much deeper, a failure to see the bigger picture, a failure to see people as more than their legal infractions, to understand the full context of their lives. As he spent time examining the larger issues of fairness and equality, Harrison found himself compelled to seek Naomi out. It was awkward at first. He didn't know how to approach her or what he could say. But he realized there was no easy way to confront the fact that he had misjudged her and her work. Naomi had stood before him, composed and resolute, and he had dismissed her without truly understanding who she was or what she represented. One afternoon, Harrison reached out to Naomi via email. The message was simple, but it carried weight. "I would appreciate the chance to sit down with you sometime. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I believe I need to learn more." Naomi received the email with some hesitation, but also with a sense of curiosity. She didn't need the judge's approval to keep moving forward with her work, but something told her this moment, his willingness to reach out, was a sign of something bigger. Perhaps they could find common ground. Perhaps they could even work together to ensure that the justice system was truly just for all. The next step in her journey was unfolding, and it seemed like, for the first time, the judge was beginning to understand the path she had been walking all along. The meeting between Naomi and Judge Harrison was set for a quiet cafe in downtown Washington, a neutral space where neither the weight of the courtroom nor the shadow of political power loomed over them. Naomi arrived first, a calm confidence radiating from her as she ordered coffee and waited. She had never sought out reconciliation with the judge, but the email he had sent had sparked something in her, a sense of responsibility, perhaps. If this meeting could offer even a small chance to bridge the divide between their worlds, she would take it. When Harrison walked in, he looked like a man trying to shake off years of certainty. He was dressed casually, a far cry from the stern figure she had seen behind the bench. He greeted her with a nod, his hands a little awkward as he pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Thank you for meeting me," he began, his voice steady but with a layer of vulnerability she hadn't expected. "I'm sure this is unexpected." Naomi smiled faintly, understanding the weight of what he was trying to say. "It's not unexpected," she replied, her tone kind but firm. "I've seen the shift. I've heard what's been happening. And honestly, I'm curious to hear where you're coming from." Harrison nodded slowly, as though he were choosing his words carefully. "I've been reflecting on our last conversation at the conference. You made me realize that I've been looking at the law through a narrow lens for far too long. I've always thought that the law was black and white. Follow the rules, and everything will be fair. But your work, and everything I've read since then, has shown me how much of it isn't fair at all." Naomi listened carefully, not interrupting, as Harrison continued. "The fine I imposed on you, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of something deeper. I've been part of a system that often treats people as cases, not as human beings. And I don't think that's justice." Naomi could see that this wasn't easy for him to admit. His profession had been his identity for so long, and for someone like him, a man of the law, to question it so openly was a significant shift. But Naomi wasn't here to offer him absolution or ask for one. She was here to listen, just as he had been forced to listen to her. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge," she said, her voice gentle. "I've spent years working within the system, but it's never been just about policy for me. It's about people, the ones whose voices get lost in all the legal jargon and rules. That's what I've been fighting for, to give them a platform, a chance to be heard." Harrison nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "I can't undo the decisions I've made in the past, but I can make a choice now. A choice to listen better, to ask more questions, and to, hopefully, make the law serve everyone, especially those who've been left behind." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Naomi felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't the end of her journey, but perhaps it was the beginning of something new, a chance for change, not just through legislation, but through an evolving understanding within the very institutions that had so often resisted it. They talked for hours, exchanging ideas, thoughts, and plans. It was the kind of conversation that didn't have a simple resolution, but laid the groundwork for future collaboration. Naomi knew that this moment, this shift, wasn't just about her. It was about something larger. It was about the growing realization that true change required people from all sides to come together, to listen and to grow. As they parted ways, Naomi felt something stir within her, a renewed sense of purpose. Her fight was far from over, but this meeting had shown her that even the smallest acts of change, like a conversation between two people, could spark a ripple effect that transformed systems, one mind at a time. And for the first time in a long while, Naomi felt like real, lasting change was within reach.